Hello, welcome everyone. This is Laura Podolsky with the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, and we are delighted that you joined us for today's webinar, Quantifying Vehicle Miles Traveled. I know that we're receiving some chats that the phone lines are full, so we did try to send out an announcement saying to access the audio for this webinar, it will have to be through the computer. We received a very large number of registrants for this webinar, and so we were limited on the number of phone lines that we could have for this webinar. So we will try to help you as we can, so please just share in the chat function if you're having problems with the audio, and we will try to help you and provide directions on accessing that audio through your computer. Also, we will be recording this webinar and posting it later, so if you have difficulties accessing it, that will also be an option. So for today's webinar, it is brought to you by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, and the Strategic Growth Council. Today's webinar will feature a presentation on a selection of vehicle miles traveled estimation methods. And from here on out, I'm going to use the term VMT for vehicle miles traveled. And so the webinar will present VMT estimation tools that are available, and will also share results from case study project used to evaluate the results, applicability, data needs, and practical considerations for each method. Following this presentation will be a discussion of the application of VMT quantification tools to current policy in California. This webinar highlights findings from a recently released draft report, Evaluation of Sketch-Level VMT Quantification Tools. And we just posted that report onto the National Center for Sustainable Transportation's event website, and you can find that link, and we'll share that in the chat box, and we'll also have it in our slides today, so you'll be able to access that. For our time today, we will start with a presentation from our speakers, who I'll introduce here shortly, and then hear comments and reflections from our special guest respondent, Chris Ganson with the Office of Planning and Research. We will have a lot of time for questions from the audience. We are going to ask that we wait for questions until after the presentation, and you can ask a question by entering that into the chat box on your lower left. And if your question is about a specific slide, just please note that number of the slide, and so we can easily return to it when we get to your question. You can also use this chat box, which many of you have, to let us know if you're running into any technical issues. Before we begin, I would like to provide just a quick introduction to the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. We are a consortium of 6 universities being led by the University of California, Davis, in partnership with the University of California, Riverside, University of Southern California, California State University, Long Beach, and the Georgia Institute of Technology and the University of Vermont. Our mission at the center is to advance a more sustainable transportation system through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. So before we get to actually starting our presentation, I would like to do a quick introduction of our speakers. Today you'll be hearing from Professor Susan Handy. She teaches in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California at Davis, and she serves as the director of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. Her research focuses on the relationship between transportation and land use, particularly the impact of land use on travel behavior, and on strategies for reducing automobile dependence. Also speaking will be Amy Lee. She is a researcher with the Institute of Transportation Studies at Davis and a graduate student in transportation policy at the University of California, Davis. Amy's professional academic work has focused on the intersection of land use and transportation as it relates to travel behavior and climate policy. After we hear from Professor Handy and Amy, we will hear from our guest respondent, Chris Ganson, who was appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, where he serves as technical lead on California's transition from level of service to vehicle miles traveled. He previously held positions at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, the World Resources Institute, and U.S. EPA Region 9. Chris holds a master's degree in city planning and transportation engineering from UC Berkeley. So without further ado, I hand it over to Professor Handy and Amy Lee.
Hi everyone, this is Susan Handy. Thank you all for being here, and again, apologies. Some people are having trouble getting the audio, but we are recording this, so it'll be available for others and for you all to listen again if you're interested. So I wanted to start with just a little bit of background to explain the motivation for this project and the objectives of what we were doing. Of course, this work, the need for VMT quantification methods, stems from AB 32, California's Global Warming Solutions Act, passed back in 2006, which put in place ambitious targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state. That was followed by SB 375, which in particular focused on metropolitan regions, led to the setting of targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions through reducing vehicle miles of traveled in metropolitan areas, and required the development and adoption of sustainable community strategies by the metropolitan planning organizations. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, the idea here was that by doing more coordinated transportation and land use planning, we could reduce vehicle miles traveled and thus greenhouse gas emissions. So of course the challenge with these, one of the challenges with these, is that the MPOs, the metropolitan planning organizations, do not have authority over land use decisions, that resides at the local level. So one thing the state has done to try and encourage local land use decisions that are compatible with these sustainable community strategies is to set up a series of funding programs that would fund the kinds of projects that we need if we're going to reduce vehicle miles of travel in the state. Many of these programs are administered by the California Strategic Growth Council. And in some cases, applicants are required to provide estimates of what their proposed projects might do by way of reducing VMT. But in general, it's important as local governments think about the kinds of projects and plans they want to put in place, that they have ways to estimate and look ahead to what these projects and plans might do in terms of reducing vehicle miles of travel in their communities. So this created a need for VMT quantification methods, these grant programs. And then, of course, later on we got Senate Bill 743, which is being implemented by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, which is shifting how we approach transportation impact analysis under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. So this change, too, has led to a need for methods and tools for quantifying VMT impacts. We're shifting away from the traditional focus on automobile delay and now thinking about transportation impacts in terms of VMT and greenhouse gas emissions. So lots of need for these quantification tools. Our specific project is funded by the California Strategic Growth Council, and I want to note that our focus has been on the needs generated by the funding programs and not SB 743. So what we set out to do, the objectives of our project, were to identify available tools and then to try them out, to assess their user-friendliness, their feasibility for use by local governments in terms of the kind of technical expertise needed, as well as the complexity of the data inputs needed for the different tools. We set out to evaluate what types of projects and plans they might be applicable for and what sort of contexts they could be used in. And then we wanted to sort of compare how they performed in terms of what kind of results they would produce. So we completed a series of case studies that Amy is going to be telling you about in a few short minutes in order to achieve these objectives. So again, a few things to note. We focus partly on plans as well as individual development projects, since some of the grant programs are funding planning activities. And that's a little more complicated than doing this kind of analysis for a specific proposed development project. I also want to note that we were not setting out to pass judgment on these tools. We are not going to tell you which ones are good and which ones are bad. You know, they all have strengths and limitations. Our goal was to really just to kick this off, this whole effort of developing these methods by looking at what we currently have and trying to understand something about how they perform. So really this is a starting point in the development of these new methods. And I should also note that we're only really going to share with you some of the highlights because we don't have a whole lot of time, and we want to make sure we have time for questions and discussion with you all. But there is a full report now available online, and we'll share the URL with you a little bit later, where you can get a whole lot more detail about these methods and about these case studies that we completed. So I think that's what I need to say by way of introduction. Let me just, actually let me go back before I go on to the next session and make this point again, that really we were focused on the use of these methods for proposals for these grant programs, and not on the use of these methods for CEQA analysis under the new SB 743 regime. The tools that we look at are clearly also potentially useful for the CEQA analysis, but obviously there are very different legal standards involved, and so we did not get into any of that. And we also did not think about how these tools would be used with respect to CEQA thresholds and the like. So I think if you're here because of SB 743, this will still be useful for you, but just that caveat that our focus was on their use for these grant programs and for planning purposes more generally. Okay, so before I turn things over to Amy, I just want to do a little overview of kind of the conceptual aspects of this. So clearly what we're talking about is a very significant shift in the practice of traffic impact assessment, which has been evolving for many decades now. So we have very well developed, largely standardized, widely accepted methods at both the regional scale and the project scale for doing transportation impact analysis. These methods are very good at answering certain kinds of questions, particularly those around congestion and capacity. But we are now asking new kinds of questions and looking at new kinds of projects, and the old methods are just not working so well anymore. So we have new questions, we need new methods. Our focus in the project was on project scale analysis rather than regional scale analysis. And I think it's especially here where we're really lacking in tools, or at least a good understanding of what tools we should be using when. And clearly there's a lot of room for further development of tools to do this kind of work. The traditional methods, though, are the starting point for the new VMT tools, and in particular, the trip generation component of traditional traffic impact assessment is really at the heart of all of these tools that we're looking at. And the idea is pretty simple, is that you can use the ITE, Institute of Transportation Engineers, trip generation rates that we've been using for decades as a way of estimating the number of vehicle trips that a project will produce. And then you multiply that by some average miles per trip, which could be derived from travel surveys or from a regional transportation model, and that would give you an estimate of the vehicle miles of travel that a project would produce. But the problem is that we know that the ITE rates really do not do a very good job for the kinds of projects that the state is trying to encourage. So we did some work here at UC Davis a few years ago where we looked at how the ITE rates did in terms of predicting vehicle trips compared to the reality at 30 different sites around California, and found that the ITE estimates were over 2 times higher than what was actually observed at these sites. So it's clear that for the purposes of VMT quantification, we don't want to just use the ITE rates as is, that's going to overestimate numbers of trips and thus overestimate VMT. So what the new methods do, the VMT quantification methods do, is still use those ITE rates, but make adjustments. So there are 2 primary ways the tools are doing this. Some of them adjust the trip rates themselves in that first step. Some of the methods produce an estimate of VMT and then adjust the VMT estimates based on the characteristics of the project and the context in which it's located. It is also possible to make an adjustment by making different assumptions about the average trip length. I show that in the slide in dotted lines because that is not built into any of these tools. We'll come back to this, but some of the tools do allow you to make adjustments to trip length, but it's not sort of the primary way that the tool is accounting for the characteristics of the project and the context of the project that might lead to lower VMT. So just another note about useful research here is that we do have a lot of research out there that tells us how the characteristics of the project and the characteristics of the context, the location of the project, could lead to lower VMT. And I want to point you to a series of research briefs that we here at UC Davis, along with researchers at UC Irvine and USC, completed a number of years ago for the California Air Resources Board, and those are all available online. And these tools, in many cases, draw on the kind of research that we've summarized in these research briefs. So that's a good place to go if you want a little more background. And with that, we're going to turn to the first part of the project, which was to simply identify what are the tools out there. And then Amy will also tell you about the case studies we did to test these out and give them a try. So Amy.
Wonderful. Thank you. So what tools are available for quantifying VMT? In short, there are many, and Susan mentioned the regional travel demand models, which have been traditionally used. We are looking at more of the sketch level tools, which are the less resource-intensive VMT estimation tools that can much more readily be used at local levels rather than requiring dedicated staff and large servers to run them. And so we identified many tools, about a dozen, and there's a wide and growing set of these VMT sketch tools that are available right now. With input from an expert panel, we narrowed our focus down to about 6 of these currently available estimation tools for evaluation in this project. Those in bold are the ones that we'll be discussing in greater depth. And so this is a general summary of their analytical approach. So we looked at the California Emissions Estimator Model, CaliMod, the California Smart Growth Trip Estimation Tool, Green Trip Connect, MXD, and Sketch 7. And so what we're showing here is the analytical approach that each of these takes. And we selected at least one from each of the methods that we discussed earlier. And so what we're showing here is that there There's a statistical adjustment that uses equations that incorporate multiple characteristics of the project and or project area. Something like housing density would be one of those characteristics that could be used to adjust VMT. And then over on the right, the elasticity method, that is where an elasticity is used to adjust the relationship between VMT and single characteristics of a project or project area, and multiple elasticities can be applied. So that would be what you would see if you've ever used CaliMod. There are multiple inputs that will aggregate to some level to adjust VMT. And so from a user's perspective, one of the most fundamental differences between these tools from the get-go is the range of land uses that they are programmed to analyze. Each of them has a unique subset of land uses that they analyze. Not every tool can be used for every type of land use project, as we show here. Notably here, Greenship Connect looks at residential projects, not retail or commercial or the industrial or the range of other land uses that you'll see on the slide. And then furthermore, this subset that each one offers, if you are a planner or a person interested in quantifying VMT and the proposed project does not have the particular, or is a land use that is not one that is listed in the particular tool you're using, that is where we can start to introduce some analyst bias, because subjective decisions have to be made as you map a proposed project onto a land use within it that you can analyze within a tool. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and grow on that. We'll expand upon that point. And so similarly, not every tool can be used for every context area. What we are talking about, what the definition that we're using when we say context area is, it's the project surroundings. It's the existing environment to which a project or development is being added. So we'll be using that term fairly frequently here. And one to note here is that the California Smart Growth Trip Adjustment Tool, it asks users for a series of land use characteristics about the project context area. And if it is not high enough residential density or employment density or a few other transportation and land use thresholds that it sets, it deems itself inapplicable for the project that you're trying to analyze. So it's looking for a smart growth project location. Okay, so we test drove these methods and this toolbox on a series of case studies to see and to compare how each of them compares with the other. For our project, we looked at about 5 different projects, different case studies. They are a variety of land uses, a variety of context areas. The first one is a corridor plan, as Susan mentioned, which is a little bit trickier in that there's not a lot of specific information usually included in corridor plans. But it's also, so it's not a particular project. It was a revitalization plan. We looked at a number of geographical areas. Most of them are based out of Northern California, as you'll note. And what we really tried to do was to simulate a local planner from a jurisdiction evaluating a project proposal, coming across a counter, trying to assess the VMT impact of that project. What we used for these projects was, we used project information from the notice of preparations that was provided. That's the preliminary, the NOP is the preliminary document in the CEQA process. So it is not a full-blown, it's very detailed environmental impact report. It's a fairly preliminary skim of various project characteristics, location, site map, land uses. In that vein of trying to get an early assessment of VMT, we also used default data values for all of these tools, such as trip lengths. This, we note, is not best practice, but we were trying to simulate this type of quick analysis that what might happen at the local level. So the case studies in bold are what we'll be talking about here. The first that I'll mention is the Cannery, which is a new, mostly residential development in Davis. It is consistent with the Regional Sustainable Communities Strategy, so it is a project that is supposedly achieving those land use and transportation strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions under the Sacramento Area Council of Governments Regional Transportation Plan. It is it's at the urban edge, so as you can see from this site map, it's a residential neighborhood to the west and also to the south, and to the north and to the east are active agriculture. And so this actually was a former industrial site of the Hunt Wesson Tomato Cannery, which is its namesake. So it is a grayfield development. We can see the breakdown of land uses and also its transit accessibility. It is set to contain both housing and about 700 jobs, so it's a fairly large employment center. The exact non-residential uses were not specified in the NOP. We know it's about 250,000 square feet of either retail or commercial, so again, some assumptions need to be made on behalf of the analyst that's looking at this. And so what we took a look at, this is what we would see when raw outputs when we run a project like the Cannery through our 6 different methods. We looked at both the 2013 version of CaliMod as well as 2016. They made some adjustments under the hood for the 2016 model. So first, I would like to explain some of these tools were not used. So not every tool was used for every case study. The California Smart Growth Trip tool did not deem this a smart growth location because of relatively low land use, housing, and employment density. Also to note is that this is showing household VMT from both Green Trip Connect and from Sketch 7. So those are only the VMT coming from the residential portions and not that commercial or retail section of the project. What is very notable here is that we get a wide range of raw outputs, so they need to be used carefully and thoughtfully, and it's very important to consider the type of question that one is trying to answer when running this type of tool, because different tools are better at answering certain questions, and they give very different outputs. But what we can start to see once we standardize them, we get a little bit more of an apples-to-apples comparison. And so we can better kind of compare how they stack up. We do still see a fair amount of variance between these different tools, but we start to see some similarities in order of magnitude, at least a couple of different clusters between the different methods. Here I will note the mitigated versus the unmitigated VMT from CaliMod. The unmitigated shows that unadjusted ITE trip rate. So the Institute of Transportation Engineers trip rate times trip lengths that were the default data values included in CaliMod. The mitigated uses those elasticities that we mentioned to adjust trip lengths according to various context area dials, quote unquote, that the users can adjust. And those are things like density and distance to transit. So a different flavor of residential project, residential development that we looked at is in San Leandro. It is the Maria Alta project. We chose this one in part because it was Green Trip certified by our friends at Transform. This means that it has included planning and design elements to reduce VMT and greenhouse gas emissions. So we want to see how this looks when we actually run it through a variety of different tools. It is a very small project relative to the one that we just saw. It was built on what was a parking lot for BART, so it has very good transit accessibility. It's an infill project. It's an affordable residential project, and it also includes about 65 units for seniors, so we'll probably not see quite as many commute trips as we'd expect from somewhere like the Cannery. When you run this through our slate of tools, you again get a smattering of outputs. This time, please note that there was a trip rate generated by the California Smart Growth Trip Tool, because this was, in fact, deemed a smart growth location. And so to find VMT from a trip rate, one would multiply that rate by an average trip length for a city or for a transportation analysis zone. And so we did that. We will show you those outputs. Also note is that we'll show you that set of standardized VMT.
I'm sorry, I interrupted Amy with a question. A question came up about what is the mitigated versus the unmitigated when you're talking about the Cal-EMOD. If you could say a couple words about that.
Absolutely. The Cal-EMOD outputs have an unmitigated VMT and a mitigated VMT. And what that is showing is that in Cal-EMOD you can run a project and it will use ITE trip rates and a standard slate of trip lengths for the given geography that your project is in. It might be a county or an air district. And the unmitigated just multiplies the trip rate times trip length for the land uses that you chose. And it doesn't do any sort of adjustment based on the project's characteristics or the project's locations. There is a screen where a user can input various project characteristics like the project's distance to transit, if it increases housing density, if it increases employment density, and those mitigation measures, quote unquote, are used to adjust those ITE trip rates, and it brings them, in this case, it brings them down because it's taking into account the project's context and characteristics. And so that is the mitigated is using those elasticities to adjust the rates and lengths.
So is it fair to say that the unmitigated is what the project would produce if it were a typical sort of suburban project?
Yes, precisely. So the IT trip rates are generally collected in relatively suburban locations with high auto dependency. That was what you would see if it was in a general garden variety suburban area. Okay. So we're looking at some of these standardized outputs for the Maria Alta project in San Leandro. Again, we see a couple of different clusters of outputs. We see a pretty high one from that unmitigated Cal-EMOD value, and then something a little bit lower coming in from the Smart Growth Tool, Green Trip Connect, and also the MXD model. To note here is that Sketch 7 was not used in this example because it uses base data that has thus far only been maintained for the Sacramento region. It's been maintained by the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. But there are versions of this tool that have been calibrated for other areas. It just does not have the requisite underlying data. Also to note here is the very different order of magnitude of these VMT outputs from what we saw at the cannery. And this is to note that when comparing projects to do that thoughtfully, you need to use a metric like VMT per household or per person because this is in fact about a third fewer housing units. So of course there will be fewer people coming off of that parcel and there will be fewer VMT trips associated with fewer people. So the importance of metrics becomes clear. Our third case study that we'll talk about today is fairly different because it's exclusively retail and commercial. This is it's a retail and commercial project. It's actually very similar to projects you see all over California. It has a Target and some surrounding, I won't necessarily say strip mall, but quite similar to that. It has in fact been one subject of research. It is located in Davis, and it has been researched by Susan Handy in the past because it was a watershed land use decision for the city of Davis. It was the first big box store in the city. In fact, it went to public vote because of that. The city has relatively little retail compared to its housing stock. And so the research that has been done was a before and after survey of Davis residents before and after the Target opened. And it did, in fact, show a net decrease in shopping-related VMT per capita by about 20% after Target opened. So the overall effect of this, you could say, effect on VMT of this store was to decrease VMT in the community. So we'll talk more about the use of project-generated driving versus a project impact on driving in just a bit, but that is an important thing to note, that these tools are not quite able to capture really well. A little bit about its specifics. It's at the very edge of the city. It's right next to Interstate 80 and the railroad, so it's not incredibly accessible by walking and bicycling. This one, again, is illustrative of the judgment that an analyst needs to use when inputting land uses, because there were several that could be applicable to this type of development within CaliMod, and then even within something like Sketch 7 and MXD. And so what do we see? These are almost exclusively showing project-generated VMT. So what are the VMT that are coming to that parcel? What we do see here is that Greenship Connect was not used because it only looks at residential VMT, as I've noted. But then also a very different output here is Sketch 7, which does, in fact, show us the change in VMT within a half-mile radius as a result of the project. So it does show us a context area and a context area adjusted by the project. Although what we can see from this is that it appears that half-mile radius is perhaps a bit too small because of what we know from the prior research that was carried out showing a decrease in VMT, whereas this shows an increase. So again, we can start to see these standardized outputs, and we see a pretty similar, tighter variance with this type of project. So another analysis that we try to do is it's hard to get a really good grasp on what these tools are showing us when we vary context and geography and land use all at once. So what we did was something that actually does not really have a real-world equivalent. We took a single project that we made as a hypothetical residential project, and we moved it throughout a metropolitan region along the urban to exurban spectrum. This doesn't really have a real-world equivalent in that projects are rarely proposed independent of a specific location. However, this does add to our understanding of the performance of these tools. And so what does this project look like? We said, let's make 10 acres of medium density residential, about 100 dwelling units. The breakdown of the housing stock is listed there. And what we did was moved it, quote unquote moved, through a metropolitan region. What is shown here is that its distance to transit, but there are a few other characteristics. We ran this tool this project through 3 tools. 2 of what we ran it through Sketch 7, Greenship Connect, and CaliMod. 2 of those, Sketch 7 and Greenship Connect, have map interfaces. So it pulls a fairly detailed, robust set of data when you select one of those parcels on the map. So there was more that changed than just distance to transit. What did this look like? And what were we looking for? So what we're able to see is that it provides greater clarity to the nuances of VMT estimates as it holds a land use variable constant while changing the project characteristics. And what we're able to see is the degree to which tools are consistent with planning theory as well. So we can see that VMT per capita is lower in urban cores and higher in suburban and exurban areas. There's a very robust, there's plenty of literature that supports the ideas that with higher densities, with shorter distances between different types of destinations, you will see less driving. It does produce some intuitive results. It also produces some non-intuitive results. What we can mostly see is a linear increase from the urban core to the ex-urban location, particularly with Green Trip Connect. We can also really see which variables are strongest or loudest in the estimation of VMT. Housing type is a very strong variable, as is transit access and the degree to which a project densifies an area. So we can see some wiggles or some wobbles in those VMT estimates as a result of those. And so what have we learned from all of this? Several things. One of our key lessons is that all of these have strengths but also drawbacks. And to note is that how easy is it to implement off the shelf? They have different degrees. One, like I would say Green Trip Connect, is quite easy to play with and get several estimates pretty quickly. But just because one can use it off the shelf does not mean that one should use it off the shelf. We did not really follow best practice by doing that. Tools are much more robust when they when you have adjusted the default data like trip lengths to capture local conditions. And also some tools have more need for adjustment. For example, CaliMod runs off of user input. So if you don't adjust that, you're getting some interesting results, whereas something like Sketch 7 or Green Trip Connect is using a database that is hosted online, in fact. So. Another takeaway was that there is no one-size-fits-all method. There is no clear winner across any of these, nor are we looking for a winner, but it is absolutely crucial to make a very conscious decision about which tool you use for which project, and also which inputs you use. So they can't just be applied blind to context or to project. And also the need to tailor the inputs that you use. A tool will only be as good as the data that you provided. So another question with very high variance, the question of accuracy comes up. Unfortunately, none of these tools have been validated with travel surveys or otherwise. So it's tricky to say which of these is accurate. It's, I think, possible to say. We couldn't tell you which one is right. So some might be inclined to argue that thus, if we don't know which one is right, should we try to do this at all? Without knowing which one's right, they can still be very useful. And it's not that we're coming from a perfectly sound science when we're estimating level of service or travel delay. So the usefulness of these tools comes in their ability to they are internally consistent, so one can compare scenarios run within the same tool to each other. And as well, if you were to set some sort of baseline or a threshold with one tool, you could compare a scenario to that. And finally, we've noted some things to watch out for when applying these and when using them. The use of metric needs to be chosen and used thoughtfully. In many cases, the planning expertise should be used and considered to look at project-generated VMT versus a project effect on VMT. A standardized metric needs to be used, especially as we showed between something like the cannery producing dozens of thousands of VMT per day versus something like Maria Alta. Those need to be put into terms that can be equated to each other so that we can really understand the transportation impacts and the transportation efficiency of a project. And further, this is relatively new practice. So as more practitioners use these tools, we will learn a lot more. We'll learn more about the strengths and weaknesses. This will take a little bit of time to build this knowledge base, but we will take some time. We'll move towards consensus about how to better do this work and how to better utilize these tools. And so given that this is relatively new, information sharing is incredibly important to see what we are all doing and what we're all learning in that light. Our report is available online. It's in draft form right now, so we welcome comments. UC Berkeley has been studying this. They have a study that's soon to be released about the implementation of SB 743. There are workshops happening around the state, and there is future research in the queue coming out of UC Davis as well. And so with that, we will turn it over to Chris Ganson, who is on the line with us today from OPR.
While we're waiting for Chris to unmute Chris, I want to say thanks very much to Amy and my former student Kevin Fang also helped with the case studies, and to our expert panel who were listed on an earlier slide who helped us identify methods and think about strengths and weaknesses and helped us narrow it down for the case studies. And another thanks to Natalie, is the person who's dealing with all these technical difficulties. Big thanks to her for running this event today. Chris, are you there? Chris, we're not getting audio from Chris. Okay, so we're trying to reach him. In the meantime, there are some questions that have come up, so we will start answering those, and you might start typing in other questions that you have. So one quick one for Amy to clarify is that nice graph from the scenario testing. Was that VMT per year? Back to, go back a couple slides.
We can in fact go back to it. Can I just go to that? I think I have to go back. Scroll back to it. It was annual VMT per new household. So this was standardized by household, and it was, yes, per year, so not daily VMT. Also, the new household it's from one of the 100 households that was a part of the project, not the context area, not the effect on VMT.
There was another question about what happened to the El Camino corridor example. I just want to remind you that we have 2 more case studies in the report, including the El Camino example. So we just presented a subset given our limited time.
And this is Chris. I just heard a beep indicating that I may have been unmuted. Have I?
Yes, we hear you,
Perfect.
Chris.
So when you're ready for me.
Okay, I'll just answer one more question. We'll turn it over to Chris, and then start typing in other questions that you might have. So there were a couple questions about the Target store in Davis actually reducing VMT and the suggestion that maybe it's the shopping housing balance. And yes, that's what it is. That before Target came into Davis, residents of Davis were driving to Woodland or Dixon or Sacramento to do their Target style shopping. So having Target in Davis actually reduced the amount of driving for shopping that people had to do. Chris, let's turn it over to you for your perspective on the methods and some of the things that OPR is thinking about.
Well, thanks, Susan, and thanks so much for having me, all of you, at setting this up at UC Davis. I appreciate the chance to share some thoughts on this study, which I think lays some really good groundwork and also points to some additional research, and I'll give some thinking on that towards the end of my comments. I wanted to start off by expanding on the use of these models. It is true that they have been getting more attention, more eyes on them from a broader constituency in recent years with the rise of the need to measure greenhouse gas emissions. But it's actually been quite important to measure VMT for some time before that. Not only do we get GHGs right by measuring VMT right, but we need it to measure noise, for example, to measure air pollutant emissions, and even to get traffic right. So to the extent we're not measuring VMT right, there's quite a bit more than just greenhouse gases that we're not getting right. And in fact, we have been modeling, and to some extent with sketch tools, for more years than we have been having a focused concern in the state on climate, on greenhouse gas emissions. We've been we've been measuring VMT using sketch tools for somewhat longer than that. Also want to point out, and this is really just echoing the researchers you heard from today, that there's quite an array of research on the factors that affect VMT. And these tools are just sort of easy translators of that research. These tools basically sit in between a large body of research and the practitioners as ways to basically distill that research and use it for day-to-day assessment. There's always the opportunity to go back to the actual research and look at it directly. Ideally, the tools help make it easier help with the combining of multiple factors, that sort of thing. In developing tools, there are a few objectives that I see anyways, and there's some trade-off between those objectives. So you want a tool to be accurate. You want it to bring the research to bear in an accurate fashion. You want it to be easy to use, and you probably also want it to be standardized so you can use it across different projects. But all of those factors can work against each other. So a tool that's standardized can become less accurate for some projects because you're trying to squeeze them into the same box, even though they've got different characteristics. Of course, the more factors you consider, the more inputs you may need, and so ease of use can go down as accuracy increases. So I just wanted to point to some of the trade-offs in the use of these tools that are just inherent in the fact that we're dealing with the complex reality of travel behavior. This was another point made by the researchers that I think is worth highlighting, that choosing the right model is important. It's very important. It's paramount. A model needs to be chosen that brings the research that's relevant to the factors that are relevant to the particular project, that's sensitive to those factors. For example, it's important to choose, if a project is near a transit station, a high-quality transit station, it will be important to choose a model that is sensitive to transit proximity, that has that built into it. If a project is located somewhere in the region that's a ways different from the average location, then it will be important that the tool has in some form sensitivity to the regional location, because that's a really important factor in VMT. It's possible to choose a tool that doesn't have sensitivity to the thing you're looking at, that essentially doesn't bring the research, the science that we know to bear in its estimation of VMT for that particular for a project. So choosing, again, tools that have sensitivity to the particular factors that the project, the particular features of the project is a fundamental importance. Using the model carefully is also important. Now, no model is foolproof. Some are made to be fairly straightforward to use. That can be helpful, but it's still really important to make sure that you're inputting factors correctly, making adjustments correctly. This study runs the models in default mode, and that provides some really useful information. Part of the information is that running these models in default mode without making tuning them to the individual projects can lead to some substantial inaccuracies. I would add that some of the models and some of the versions that were looked at here, in particular one I happen to know of, CaliMod, has in its earlier version, not as familiar with the later version, I believe it's the 2013 version, has some known formula errors. The AHSC guidelines, so this project was focusing or was funded, and the idea was to focus more on its use for the SGC grant programs. And in earlier versions of those guidelines, and I believe in more recent versions as well, they actually provide guidance on doing some off-model calculations in parallel while using CaliMod, because it's known that CaliMod actually has had some built-in errors in the formulae. I'll point to another example with CaliMod because it's a tool that I'm more familiar with, which is that it uses by default, if you run the model off the shelf or out of the box, it will give you trip lengths. Now, Susan illustrated at the near the outset of the presentation that vehicle miles traveled is the two factors that go into it are trip generation and trip length. So each of those two factors is quite important. They're just multiplied by each other. If you get either one of them far off, you're going to get a VMT answer that's far off. CaliMod has built into it average trip lengths that are for, in some cases, counties and in some cases entire regions. Whereas in fact, trip lengths vary by a factor of probably a few, or certainly a few, and maybe typically even 2 to 4 times between centrally located areas where trip lengths are short and outlying areas where trip lengths are long. So if you're just using those built-in trip lengths in CaliMod, you're going to get an answer that's off by a factor of perhaps 2 or 3 in those extreme cases, depending on how you there's those other opportunities to adjust in CaliMod, but using it out of the box, you're likely to get some answers that are quite off. And we've developed, and this is for in the SB 743 context, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of minutes. We have developed we first here at the state of California provided trip length data that can be inputted into CaliMod to override those default average lengths, and that data exists for the entire state of California. So that's available. It's up on Caltrans's website. But this is using those data are important in order to get accurate answers out of that particular sketch model, just to use that as an example. Let's see. One additional point that these tools have varying levels of transparency, how feasible it is as a researcher to open the hood and look at what's going on inside. Now, the need for transparency is not new with the focus on greenhouse gases that we now have. As I pointed out, we've needed to get VMT calculations accurate for some time and for a number of reasons. But with greenhouse gases, we're using these tools yet more and have yet another reason to make sure we're getting them right. And some of these tools are not very transparent today. It's not actually possible to pull up the hood and look inside them and see what assumptions they're using. And I want to opine that should be corrected, that measuring VMT is not so complex that it needs to be a black box. That's one of the benefits, and I'll talk about this again in a moment, of the shift in the CEQA context to VMT from LOS, is that VMT need not be a black box, and as it need not be, it shouldn't be. Having more eyes on a model offers the opportunity to see what it's doing, and that allows you to get more accurate answers on a project. It allows you to use the model more accurately, and it also gets eyes on a model because to the extent there is complexity in these models, more eyes can catch errors, as were found ultimately in some of the CaliMod formulae a few years ago. So a plug for transparency in these models. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the CEQA context as we are in the late stages of implementing, or arriving at the late stages of implementing SB 743, which will provide more additional customers for these LOS models, additional folks that are needing to measure LOS. I want to say at the outset that from a legal perspective, CEQA doesn't require perfection. It requires a best effort. And from a technical perspective, we don't need perfection either. We don't need exact to 4 decimals out a VMT answer. We need actionable data. We need to know with reasonable confidence whether a project will exceed or not significance thresholds, whether it will have a significant, load a significant amount of vehicle travel onto the roadway network or not. And so I want to take a step back and compare. And Amy kind of began to crack this open at the end of her presentation of the accuracy that we've enjoyed to date in transportation analysis in the CEQA context, and that's using the Automobile Level of Service Standards, or LOS, metric. So I'll take a quick sidebar dive here into the accuracy we have today in the CEQA context. LOS, unlike VMT, requires the analysis of volumes of traffic and then goes beyond volumes, a delay calculation at individual intersections. So you need to not just know the aggregate of the additional vehicle travel loaded onto the roadway system, but exactly where it's going to go, whether it's going to make left turns at a certain intersection, right turns at a certain intersection, go straight through. And we can model that, but the thing is the accuracy at a particular intersection is relatively poor. For a road as large as 15 or 20,000 vehicles per day, the accuracy of volume data is plus or minus 40%. That's the allowable error in the modeling guidance. And then that micro simulation takes it from there, works with that plus or minus 40% data to provide delay information. Those errors that feed through that process and delay, the plus or minus 40% at any given intersection, can lead to a difference in LOS of a letter grade or two, and they certainly aren't reflected in when delay is reported to 3 or 4 decimal places. And one of the great advantages of VMT, even as we are working to hone these tools, is that it's an aggregate figure, so it's much easier to get an accurate answer for it. You don't need to figure out what's going on at any one intersection and trace travel along routes. You just need to know what's going on in the aggregate. You need to know the average trip length from the project, and then the average the average trip generation. Okay, so wanted to make a few suggestions around further. Oh, actually, I have one more point I want to make before I talk a little bit about some suggestions for further research. Amy raised the differences between project-based VMT, that's trips generated by or attracted to a project, and the project's cumulative effect on VMT. And we provided some recommendations in our draft guidance, and we're going to carry those recommendations forward into our forthcoming guidance on which of those sorts of methods to use. Simply put, you can take a deeper dive into this by looking back at our materials on 743 from our last release and the technical advisory that we provided then. But to put it briefly, we're recommending for residential and office projects looking at trips generated or attracted to the project and comparing those to thresholds. We're recommending for retail, because retail doesn't tend to produce wholly new trips. It tends to reroute trips from other retail. People don't start shopping when you build that target. People reroute, as Professor Handy's research showed us a number of years ago. So we recommend looking at the cumulative VMT in the area and whether that goes up or down with retail. Again, a deeper dive available looking at our guidance on our OPR's website. So for further research, one next step that seems maybe an early next step is to look deeper under the hood at these models and what's going on, what's leading to the disparities in VMT measurements. Is it differences in trip generation? Are they assuming differences in trip generation? Are they assuming differences in trip length? Are those factors easily accounted for if we, for example, use trip length data that we have readily available that I mentioned earlier? there was an example in the case studies that were done for this project of a project that was going to be occupied by a large number of seniors. For example, was one of the models capturing that those folks living there were going to be, that the project was going to be occupied by seniors, and another wasn't? That would provide a lot of information. It would inform us as to why that discrepancy, why there were discrepancies in the VMT figures. I noticed also that there's a CaliMod example unmitigated in one of the projects, and an MXD ITE trip generation unadjusted. So those were two unadjusted, yet the numbers were different between those two. That should be before the models even got their hands on the data, if I understood those numbers right. Why were those different? It sounds like they were pulling from different data sources, and maybe with different meanings that one might be appropriate in one circumstance and one might be appropriate in another. Amy also suggested, and I would echo this suggestion, that additional validation would be useful to measure, do measurements of VMT from a project which has been assessed by one of these tools to see what really happened. Now, you don't want particularly, especially in a small development where perhaps some people moved in who like to go skiing a lot, so their VMT is really high. You don't want to peg that necessarily to the developer. You don't want to You don't want to do question the assessment necessarily from individual developments for SQL purposes, but for improving the models, it would be useful to have many of these surveys in aggregate. What we want to look for in the SQL context is, and in the project assessment context, is a developer putting into effect measures which we statistically know generally have an effect on VMT, not necessarily whether people happen to move into the unit that they in particular have low VMT. So a couple of next steps that are a little further, looking a little bit further forward. It would be useful to take a step back and look at the VMT, what we know about VMT, connecting land use measures and VMT in the research. There's quite a bit of research, the so-called Ds, the factors that we know of statistically connected, that statistically connect land use factors such as density or regional location, transit proximity, et cetera, to VMT. But to look and see what we don't know. Are there factors that we know we don't know, and maybe there's a research agenda that can be set more clearly, and then perhaps a roadmap of bringing that data, both any existing data that isn't yet harnessed by the tools, and then future research into the tools, so that we can continue to make VMT assessment tools more and more accurate. So I'll stop there so we have some time for questions. Thanks again for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts.
Thank you, Chris. I think you actually answered a lot of the questions that have come up, and I'm hoping you're going to now look at this list of questions and see if there are things you want to say more about. While you're doing that, I think Amy and I have spotted a couple things we want to say a few words about. This issue of validation, very important one. I do want to note that some of the tools that adjust trip generation rates from the IT rates have been validated, and we did some of that work here at UC Davis that's available through our website somewhere. You know, the thing is, it's much easier to collect trip generation data than it is to collect VMT data. So we do have trip generation data for quite a few sites in California that are, you know, smart growth, VMT, low VMT sorts of sites. So the next step is then to figure out, well, how could we validate for VMT? And does that mean doing the kind of before and after household survey that we did for the Target study in Davis? One of you out there suggested big data, and that's certainly something that transportation researchers are looking at. What could we extract from data collected through people's smartphones moving around that might give us real-world number about how much VMT is coming to and from a site. But again, here we're going to need to think about whether we're focusing on VMT to and from a project or the larger effect of the project on VMT in that area, and that would require different sorts of data collection to do the validation. Let's see, did you have?
Sure, a couple of simple ones. One person asked who maintains these various tools. Different people maintain different ones. Also, which one is used most? So the South Coast Air Quality Management District maintains CaliMod. The Sketch 7 has thus far been maintained by SACOG in the Sacramento area, the Council of Governments. MXD is used, there are a couple different versions, but primarily Fair and Peers uses it a lot, the consulting firm, and they developed a version that is readily available through the EPA, Cal EPA. California Smart Growth Trip Estimation Tool was built by researchers here at UC Davis, and the Green Trip Connect tool is based on research by Newmark and Haas, who are researchers, and it is hosted by Transform and the Center for Neighborhood Technology. So they've been doing the work on that. Which one is used the most? Probably the most common name that you would recognize is CaliMod because it's used by air districts, and it was also used for affordable housing, sustainable communities grants. But that depends who you ask, for sure. But that one is very well known.
We have a bunch of wonderful questions. Some of these are beyond the scope of this project. There's some very interesting suggestions from the audience about all kinds of things. Chris, there are a number of CEQA EIR-related questions I'm hoping you can take a look at. I do have a suggestion from somebody in the audience that their company tracks VMT. How can we help you? So I think there really is a lot of opportunity, and as we said, it's we're really just in the development stage with these methods, with lots of improvements to come. Chris,
so
want to jump in with anything?
I'm happy to. I don't have the questions in front of me, however, so I need them read to me. If you see a good one, please share.
Oh, so you're not seeing the questions.
I'm not privy to the questions without you reading them for me.
Yeah, well, there are questions about when the guidelines will be. Any update from Chris on timing for finalizing the guidelines, when they'll become mandatory for lead agencies to use?
Yeah, that's a very frequent question I get these days. So I don't have the most satisfying answer. We're working to get through some of the processes that need to be done before the formal rulemaking process begins. But we're going to try and get that together. We're trying to move it to that stage as quickly as we can. As far as the opt-in period, that also it may rely some on this. We had our last recommendation was that the opt-in period, the most recent draft that I've seen has the opt-in period running through the beginning of January 2019. In general, I'll take this opportunity to provide to recommend that there are a number of reasons to start thinking about VMT assessment in CEQA, not the least of which is there's some case law that has that's pointed to that it should be already being done in the CEQA context. So our recommendation is to go ahead and start doing the thinking at your local jurisdiction on how you're going to want to implement VMT. We have now 3 cities in California, San Francisco, Oakland, and Pasadena, that have implemented VMT, so they provide some good examples. More are going to be coming online as well, so there'll be more good examples out there. But start doing that thinking and work to bring that to your jurisdiction now is our recommendation.
So there are quite a few questions having to do with SB 743, and not so much about these tools, but other aspects of implementing 743. So I do want to point you to the workshop that will be happening in August, and I'm sure other work that OPR is doing to help you understand all that. We'll make sure Chris gets copies of all the questions that got asked today so that he can be providing answers through his work. There were a couple other things I wanted to note. Somebody asked about highway goods movement, and really these methods are not doing anything about goods movement. It's all about passenger travel. So I think that's an important point to put on the future development list. There was a couple of questions about sort of making the decisions about the adjustments. And Amy alluded to this a little bit. Do you want to talk about?
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. So there are a couple different tools that have these types of adjustments. CaliMod has some, and MXD looks at user input adjustments as well. So they are somewhat subjective. Again, there's some analyst judgment that goes into them. The definitions of them are available somewhere in the depths of the CaliMod User's Guide. So they are things like you check a box if this project increases the housing density. And increasing the housing density is it increasing it beyond a standard suburban development of about 7 units to the acre? And it is things like is there transit nearby, and you can input the distance in miles to the closest high quality transit stop. So it has to have fairly frequent transit service or rail service. Those are the ones that are coming to me offhand. So there's also one for employment density. Is it near an employment center? MXD also has things like that. What is the employment density or the distance to the central business district? What is the housing density? What is the distance to transit? Is transit on-site or across the street? So it's inputs like that are things that lead to those adjustments that we showed you in VMT outputs.
So a couple points to follow up on that. Chris made the point about transparency being really important, and I think this is a situation where whoever is doing this analysis really needs to be clearly documenting what the assumptions were and what were the bases for those assumptions.
Absolutely.
And then a question came up about adjusting trip length in particular, and what's the best evidence, what are the best sources for choosing trip lengths. I don't know, Chris, you've thought a lot about that. I don't know if you want to add a few more words about trip lengths.
Yeah, I can chime in on that. I think generally the best source of trip length data will be the regional travel demand model, but you could also go to travel survey data or big data type data. We have as I mentioned this already, the statewide travel demand model has been run to provide, a model run has been done to provide trip lengths, which can now just be picked off of an Excel spreadsheet that's on the web on Caltrans's website. And so trip length data, we have coverage for the entire state. I would say that in the particular case of being near the edge of a region, the statewide travel demand model might be better because if the regional travel demand model hasn't been updated, and it still truncates VMT at the regional boundary, so you lose some over the edge. then the statewide model might be a better choice. But generally, if you have regional travel demand model trip lengths available, I'd use those.
Yeah, and you're talking about using the trip lengths for that area, so whatever traffic analysis zones
Correct.
the model is built around?
So yeah, what we have provided, what Caltrans has provided is an Excel table of traffic analysis zone of the statewide travel demand model, all 5,000 something of them, and what average trip lengths are in each of those for various trip types that then feed directly into that you can feed directly into CaliMod.
Sure. So follow up on use of regional models, and then another one. Someone asked if it would, if a sketch model could capture the benefits of diverted trips from something like a retail development, like we saw with the Target study. That is something that a regional model can catch because it's showing the distribution and the change of distribution once the land use pattern is changed. Unfortunately, sketch tools do not really well capture that yet. That's future development and research to be done. In the meantime, that is good job security for planners. And
researchers.
And researchers as well. We're all in luck. And someone asked about in the realm of kind of the validation, did we compare our results to the traffic studies that were done for the projects that we looked at? We did take a look at those, and we, within an order of magnitude, ballparked fairly similarly, got fairly similar outputs when we compared ours to, let's say, the VMT estimates that were done for the EIR. Some differences, absolutely, because of two different analysts running the same project in even the same tools. You can get different outputs, but they were within an order of magnitude for sure. So we were able to look at, especially our outputs of MXD and CaliMod with traffic analysis studies.
So we've reached the end of our allotted time. I want to thank everybody for listening in. We hope this has been helpful. We will save all the questions, and as I said, share those with Chris and others. If you have questions about our work after you take a look at the report, feel free to email us. And I believe we will be sending out an email with a link to the recording of this webinar, and we can probably put the report URL in there as well. So that'll go out sometime shortly. Laura, do you want to do anything to wrap up?
That was a great wrap up. So again, thank you everyone. This is Laura Podolsky. So thank you again everyone for joining us. We'll try to get to the questions that we weren't able to answer in the webinar. So we have all of those noted. And like Susan said, we'll be sending out an email later this afternoon with links to the presentation, recording, and draft report. So thank you so much, and this concludes today's webinar.